wanted to make this video for my website, which is the site for the Center for Literate Values, and also for one of my classes, the class in the first half of world literature, because in both cases I think that crucial is some kind of explanation of what literate values are. What is it that distinguishes literacy from what has been called lately orality, or the oral traditional mindset? Of course, when you start reading works way back at the dawn of time, you're looking at cultures that obviously have some kind of literacy, because there's nobody there with a camera or a tape recorder to put down what they were saying, but it was a very basic literacy. Often, as in the case of the Epic of Gilgamesh, it was more like a set of hieroglyphs, which only a very privileged elite class, probably a priestly class, even knew how to read and write. And for the rest of the people, this mysterious script that could reproduce words was magical. So this is not alphabetic literacy of the kind that we see later in the Mediterranean world. An alphabet is a series of symbols that each of which represents a sound. It's really easy compared to so many other writing systems in the world, which might require years to master. Really easy to master an alphabetic system of writing, and there's a kind of socially liberating quality to that too, that allows people of the underclass, because they don't need really that much time and effort to acquire this sort of literacy, to better their lot and to rise in life economically. This is one of the reasons why the Greek world, the Mediterranean world, was kind of the cradle for a lot of the social and political evolution that we prize to this day, and which has become part of our Western style of living. But to go back to what might be called pure orality, of course, again, as I was saying, we just have to speculate about this, because all the texts that we have are obviously already kind of knocking at the door of a sort of baby literacy, an initial shift in the stage of thinking. But we can reconstruct these really simple cultures by making a number of safe suppositions. Clearly, they are cultures that prize memory, because before the baking of the Gilgamesh story into clay, or the writing down of whatever sacred documents you had on some sort of papyrus, the only way of remembering the religious teachings, the commandments, the laws, the tales, perhaps the verses about when to plant and when to harvest, all these things, they would be entrusted to the memory of the next generation. And if the next generation forgot, then the culture was kind of screwed. There was no second chance. It's like a relay. If you drop the baton, then you're going to lose. It has to be passed safely from one generation to the next. There are various strategies that traditional societies probably used to pass the baton. I kind of alluded to one of them. Many of these sacred texts are versified, like the Homeric epics, which naturally were written down, but we can presume that they were memorized for generations before somebody finally did write them down. The verse form in this case is rather, it's not like we think of poetry. It's kind of sing-song. It has a lot of flexibility within it. It's a sort of verse where you could kind of grope about for a second. Maybe you could misremember something a little bit and still not stumble and fall on your face. In the case of Homeric verse, particularly, Homeric verse is made up of a bunch of formulae that can click into place like Lego blocks. So if you're groping for something to fit into a certain series of beats in the meter, you can quickly, if you're kind of, the wheels are spinning the way mine are right now, you can find something that metrically fits the spot, but may not in terms of relevance of description or relevance to the plot. It may not be the perfect set of words to have right there. So I guess we literates nowadays look back at Homer and at similar texts, and we kind of read them with a certain tolerance, a grain of salt, because we just assume there are going to be some irrelevancies in there. I used to be able to recite some Homeric lines. I'm going to try to do let me try to do the first few verses of the Iliad. Meinen aidethea peleia deo achilleos, ula menen he moria chaios algeateken, polas diffimus psychas aidi proiapsin, hero on autuste, hedoria telche kunesin, oio noisite passi, dios de teleet obule, exudeta prota diaste te nerisante, Atreides Devanaxandron kai dios Achilles. Now that's the invocation of the muse at the beginning, and it's just, as many commentators have said, Homer's just kind of starting in medias res. He just oral tales. They, in a sense, have no beginning and no end. They're not like literate stories that can be contained in a book. They have a front page and a back page, and they have a building climax, and everything contributes to the movement of the plot. They're part of a whole sequence of connected stories and myths that really has no set parameters. And these are stories that people are told from the cradle to the grave, and naturally when the performer is performing, he assumes that everybody in the audience has heard the whole vast web of these stories. So as we read these things, we often find that allusions come up that we don't understand if we're just reading within a particular text like the Iliad, but the original listeners, having heard the whole mythic cycle, would know what the teller's talking about. Let me get back to that in just a minute, but I was going to say about those opening lines of the Iliad, just that already, I hope you could tell by the way that I tried to muddle through them that each line has a specific measure, but it can also be resolved into a series of long stresses or short stresses. As I said, there's a lot of flexibility there, in case the poet is kind of struggling for an instant and has to click in another formula. Just in the opening line, the phrase "Pei leadeo Achilleos," the wrath of Achilles, the son of Peleus. Why do you have to denominate Achilles the son of Peleus? It fills out the line. It creates a few more beats so that the poet can kind of be looking down the road a little bit and trying to remember the next few lines. That's one explanation. I think, too, though, that's really rather unfair. I think oral traditional people are a lot smarter than we're apt to give them credit for. They remember, because they have this focus on memory and on the importance of the past, it's important to them who your father is and who your grandfather, your bloodline. There's a connectedness there that in our more individualistic literate society we're not familiar with, and that we have to kind of struggle to understand. And of course, in the case of Achilles, I think this is really very relevant to the plot of the whole Iliad, the fact that he is a descendant not just of Peleus, who's a great hero, but in fact his mother, of course, is a goddess. So he's one of the demigods. He has a lot of the characteristics of a god. He's a Superman. He has physical powers that ordinary mortals can only dream of. And this makes him kind of a double-edged sword, as is typical of oral traditional heroes. Because they are close to the gods. They're often like Gilgamesh too. They're descended from the gods. They have this thing in their DNA where they think they can do practically anything. I don't think they should have to abide by the rules for ordinary mortals, so they can go out and rout an entire army of mortal men, which is great for the city-state that they represent. But during times of peace, they're not necessarily going to settle back and eat barbecue with the neighbors and mow their lawns in a well-behaved fashion. They can be very volatile. They can be troublemakers. And when they start making trouble for the community, as Achilles does in the Iliad, they can instigate great tragedy. Well, anyway, because we know that Achilles is descended from the gods, and because Homer kind of reminds us of that in the first line, that he's descended from this line of great heroes, to me, this kind of highlights, it puts a frame around the confrontation between Achilles, who's the old style hero, the demigod, and the new style, not really hero, but the new style power figure, Agamemnon, who is a political power. He's the high king, the commander-in-chief, but he's not a physical Superman. So I think the Iliad already is kind of waving goodbye to traditional values in a way. The epic is about the shift from a purely tribal, traditional kind of mentality to something new and more organized, and something where it's more complex, it's more artificial. The people who have power don't have it just because they have the strongest fist. They have it because of more complicated and abstract factors. So, even Homer, I would argue, is already kind of loosening his ties to this pure oral traditional tribal mentality that I'm trying to talk about. I would say that in a truly tribal society, well, even in Homer you see it, but it's very, very tightly knit, very communal. The people, because they speak everything that is knowledge to them, everything that is relevant to them, if anything percolates to the top of their mind, they have to speak it if it's going to be communicated. There's no writing. And once something is spoken, it becomes public knowledge. The Irish have a saying, a proverb, "Nisce rune must rire." There's no secret anymore if three people know it, because then everybody in the community knows it. And we're talking about a hunter-gatherer community. A hunter-gatherer, it's probably just only 25 or 30 people large anyway. But even larger communities, if they're oral, then life constantly orbits the forum or the marketplace or again, the hunter-gatherer society wouldn't have those, but you'd have women working away at the food for the day, and the men would come back with their hunt and skin the animals and so forth. And they're talking while they do all of this. Everything is communal. So the mindset of the individual isn't really programmed to think, how do I look to do they understand what's really going on inside of me? I'm having an identity crisis. All I do is wear these feathers and wear this paint, and I look just like one of the tribe, but who am I as an individual? They don't go through that crisis, which is a literate kind of crisis. They identify so closely with the community that they would have an identity crisis if they got cut off from it. They want to be one. They want to be an appendage of the whole body. And in fact, this is kind of what Achilles goes through when he unwittingly withdraws from the war effort, goes back to his tent, and puts himself in this situation where he's no longer the superhero that everybody looks up to. Who is he when he withdraws himself from that communal identity? That's what tribal societies, where they get their meaning. It's from the group. The individual has no meaning except as a part of the group. The individual's ethical thinking is indexed to what the tribe thinks is proper. What the tribe thinks is proper, again, is what the tribe has inherited from the past, and what it goes to great lengths to put in some kind of verse or some kind of memorable form. A proverb, as I was just trying to remember from the Irish myself, things that are memorable and can be passed along. This is, it's all of life, all of your value system is orbiting around these things that are passed along from generation to generation. And wisdom and the sacred myths around which the wisdom is built are seen as originally coming from the golden age of the gods and the superheroes, these people that Gilgamesh and Achilles are descended from. These are either gods or people who spoke to the gods and lived with the gods. So everything behind you, and in fact the operative metaphor in Homer and in most traditional societies, that the past is in front of you, it's the future that's behind you. But everything in the past is better because it's closer to the golden age, closer to the age when the gods were actually talking to us. And as we get, as a human race, as we get older and older, our descendants grow farther and farther apart from that connection with the gods. They become morally and physically punier. And most mythic traditions, in fact, have a kind of Ragnarok, as they say in the Nordic tradition, or a day where everything melts down, an Armageddon. It's a pessimistic vision where things can only get worse. And again, the obligation of the individual human being is to try to keep the ways of the past alive as long as possible, and to stay as close to them as you can, and never to, ultimate sin is the sin of what they call in Greek hubris, which is to measure yourself against the gods or to butt heads with the gods. The heroes could do that because they were part god themselves, but even the heroes ultimately hit the floor of Olympus a little too hard, and they fell down and died. And it's as if I could use a figure, it's as if their bodies lie like great mountains around the parameter of this traditional society. So nobody living right now in this society dare go beyond the mountain ranges. The example created by the heroes in the past, if that's as far as they could go, if that's the most that they could do, then what can we puny mortals of this generation do? We can't even reach the slope of those mountains. So it behooves us to be very accepting and resigned and humble, and those are the virtues of a traditional society. They're not virtues, by the way, that are drawn from the gods or are identified as being very close to the gods. The gods, like the superheroes, do what they want. The gods are not like us. What's good for a god is not good for a man. Gods are not humble. They're not resigned. They're in traditional societies, they're identified closely with forces of nature. And you know what nature is like in a very low-tech society that has fire and maybe the wheel, but doesn't really understand meteorology or volcanism or earthquakes. All of those violent things that happen in nature happen because of these inscrutable gods. And the tribe, the tradition will give them a certain human-like character by anthropomorphizing them. I think it's fair to say that these traditions, in trying to understand why famines and floods and lightning strikes and other things happen, they project human feelings, which are going to be pretty passionate and vengeful, whimsical, angry, even sort of childish, spoiled brat feelings onto nature. And that's what's happening when the lightning hit his thatch hut and it caught on fire and burned up. Well, he must have messed up his sacrifice or something, and God got angry at him and zapped him. But the gods do anything they want. We don't really understand them. We don't have a pipeline to them that runs from our inner being to what they say is right and wrong. We just have to sort of, again, stay humble and keep our heads bowed and sacrifice to them regularly and hope that we don't do something wrong in one of those rituals, because they're basically inscrutable. And I could take all of these things that I've talked about so far and just turn them on their ear. The contrast with literacy, if you go down the line, is pretty stark. And I might say, this isn't the first time that I've tried to do this little film here, and on all occasions it really strikes me how hard it is to talk in an empty room to a camera, because this is an empty room, and I feel like I'm crazy talking to myself, basically. It's speech, when you don't have a crowd around you, seems really weird. I'm letting things out of me, and there's nobody to receive it. If I take this book and if I start looking at a passage within it, I don't have to read this out loud. Of course, this is a whole different subject. There is an intermediate phase between orality and literacy, and in that phase, which can be quite long, actually reading out loud to the audience as if it were an oral performance is very common. But eventually people learn how not to move their lips, not to read the text out loud. Apparently the ancient Romans thought Julius Caesar was kind of a magician, because he could read a document and his lips didn't even move. That was really weird. But we can do this now. We're very familiar with it, and as we do this, we're taking in information that nobody else in the room is listening to, and really over a period of years, if we keep reading, we amass a body of information which is unique. Nobody else in the world has read precisely the same documents that we've read. All of this serves, just the act of reading, as I was trying to describe, stresses a kind of interiority. It makes you aware that you can sort of create a voice inside of you. You can talk to yourself internally, and there's no sound traveling out into the world. So you become aware that there's a kind of distance between yourself and others. Then the information that you take in and the way that you assemble it in your worldview, that's a whole different factor that also emphasizes your uniqueness, your individuality. So now you're no longer just an appendage of the tribe. In fact, and I think this is perhaps the most precious gift of literacy, when you fine-tune this technique of turning within, you learn to build your own values. What's right and what's wrong is not necessarily what everyone around you is doing, or what the past even has said is right and wrong. The past is still a reliable benchmark, but only after you pass it in review and are through your own analysis of the values that you've inherited, you decide, yes, these are good values, and I understand them, and this is why they're good. But for a value to be genuine, I think, I say this as a member of a literate culture, you have to do it not slavishly because this is what the tribe has always done, or this is what's always been done in the past, but you have to do it because you are convinced. That's what the word conviction means. You have decided in your heart, yes, this is right. And sometimes those decisions, as I say, will lead you actually to go against the group. So there's so many things happening here that create a kind of tension or a kind of friction between the individual and the group. Now, the individual doesn't necessarily have to be literate himself, or you can look at teachers like Socrates and Jesus and Confucius and all of these people who were literate and who did train themselves by reading, actually did not leave books behind them. Their teaching method was not to write out and circulate documents. They had followers who did that for them. Their teaching method continued to be oral, interestingly. So obviously you can acquire that literate awareness of self and that sense of conscience and responsibility, but it doesn't mean that you go around reading all the time, and you might not really yourself, you might not be able to read at all. But if the ice is beginning to thaw in your society, if there are other figures like that, like Jesus and Socrates and Confucius, if this new way of looking at things is beginning to percolate through the society, then it can influence individuals who themselves are not literate or pre-literate. So this is a kind of a sound barrier. This is a major change in the way that human society lives and the way that people look at things. There's so much stuff that I could talk about, but I mentioned conscience. That again, that's perhaps the single most important gift of literacy, and in terms of the Center for Literate Values, I think that's one of the objectives that we're most dedicated to is the promotion of individual conscience. Adults must feel that they're doing things because these things are right, they're good. If you have adults simply doing things because the group that they identify with is doing them, then I don't call a person like that very mature. I think a person like that is kind of locked in adolescence, and I want to reach out and turn the lock and get that person to internalize his values, be able to think about things so that he discovers not what everybody else is doing, but what is truly good. That's what I think that's in our society. That's what we want our children to become, our friends to become, ourselves to become more that way. That's the goal for which we strive. That's what it means to become a better person. And of course, the concept of the gods is no longer one of weather makers, but as society evolves in this more inward turning direction, we have science to explain natural phenomena, and science is another important gift of literacy. You can't have science unless you can write down your experiments accurately, the way that other people can repeat them and build upon what you've done, like the dwarf sitting on the shoulders of the giant. But science kind of robs traditional religion of its potency, because it takes all these powers that were once attributed to Olympus and it dulls them out to various more or less rational natural forces. So the role that's left over for the gods to play is that of being the origin of that internal voice, that author of right and wrong. And of course, the gods quickly become God in this transition, because it would be ridiculous, it would be schizophrenic, kind of crazy, if the author of our understanding of what's right and wrong were actually 3 or 4 or 5 different minds. Then you'd have 3 or 4 or 5 different versions of right and wrong, and there has to be just one. So to the extent that the divine is identified with that, there's a movement from polytheism to monotheism. I must also say that this is obvious, I think, in scientific culture there's also a movement away from any sort of metaphysical belief at all, because many people become so impressed at the ability of science to explain away the phenomena once attributed to the action of the gods that they conclude that, well, obviously there's not really anybody up there at all. It's all explained by natural law. So, and then I think this is in a way typical of literate society, that where it gets better, it gets much better. But where it can also paradoxically peel off in the other direction. You see this in terms of social unity too, where when people discover within them a kind of humanity that they can abstract to all other people, it turns them into lovers of freedom and lovers of equality, the idea of human rights, basic freedoms for all people, respect for all people. This emanates from the analysis, the turning inward and finding your humanity that's locked away inside of you, and then abstractly you realize, well, that's in everybody. It doesn't matter what their skin color is, or how old they are, or what tribe they're in, or even really what religion they belong to. Maybe I found this because of the God that I worship, but those guys don't even worship the same God, but they're still human beings. If I found this inside of me, then I know that it's inside of them too. And that's a wonderful place to be. But literate society at the same time, because it's making us sort of peel off as individuals and find our personal meaning for life, some of us can mark out very private little places for ourselves. We have these specialist little things that we do. We don't really need the whole group anymore. Even if we did, we don't have the whole group anymore. The rest of the group doesn't have time enough for us. We're not gathering berries and hunting antelope. We're all doing dozens or hundreds of different things. We move around too much. We don't spend time with each other. We don't see each other. There's a kind of fracturing of the society, and an unintended promotion of what's called solipsism, of complete absorption in the self. And our electronic technology, things like the internet, and before this television, and all of these things that create diversions for us when we're sitting alone in our apartment room or wherever, they have really, if you think about it, the unhappy effect of making us comfortable being isolated from others. We think we're not because we're looking at people on this TV show or on the internet, but we're not really interacting with them in a personal, vital, spontaneous way. So literate culture, again, can lift us up higher than we've ever been as human beings, but it can also, and for the very same reasons, it's that proverbial two-edged sword. It can create problems that we've never had before. I might add that I need to wrap this up anyway, but in my belief, where we're headed with electronic technology is an uncharted passage that holds many shoal waters in it. It could be a very dangerous ride. I remember when I was a kid, Marshall McLuhan was being talked about and appearing on variety shows, and he was kind of a wild man who had these crazy ideas that he expressed in a crazy fashion, that television was going to rejuvenate us and take us back to the tribal. It was going to make us more immediate and spontaneous. We wouldn't be these passive, distant readers of texts that nobody else could. Don't bother me, please, I'm reading. And I wouldn't withdraw into the book. We would actively be, and if you had an experience of an old black and white TV set, you would understand that there was a certain amount of truth to what he said when he said that watching TV was mentally very active. You had those grainy black and white images, and you actually had to sort of imagine to complete the picture. But McLuhan was really upbeat because he thought the 50s and the 60s were a pretty drab, not very groovy place to be, and he felt that electronic technology would be a real shot in the arm for the human race. It is not, in my opinion, the throwback to oral tradition, to the noble savage, which is kind of what McLuhan is alluding to, that he thought it to be. We are acquiring some of the attributes of a tribal society. I see kids going to extravagant lengths to identify themselves with a group. They do things to themselves that, pardon me, but they almost look like self-mutilation. Very attractive people will do things to their faces or put things in their faces that I'm asking myself, why are they doing that? Well, it's that I understand, they're trying to belong to a certain group. They'll do their hair a certain way, they'll wear certain clothes, they'll even have tattoos of a certain kind, and these are things that, we can associate them with the behavior of tribal people and oral tradition. So, to an extent, there are certain tribal behaviors that seem to be revived among us these days. But that vital tribal adoration of the past, that sense of the golden age, that desire, that obligation to do things the way that they've always been done, to be a good servant of your grandfather's ways. Boy, that's all gone, isn't it? I mean, the tribe now, these electronic tribes, seem to run on change. All of them are the more change, the better. But maybe that's why they're clicking together tribally, is because there's too much change, and they're trying to find some group of people that they can join hands with as they're riding out these waves of change. But there's not any sort of deep-seated regard for tradition, and indeed there are no traditions. What traditions remain vibrant among us? We've lost them left and right. And I think that one of the main reasons for that is this technology. So to the extent that I endorse literacy and try to promote it through the Center for Literate Values, it's because I think we're at a dangerous time, and we need to recover our inner ballast, our sense of the inner light, our personal obligation to do the right thing, which doesn't depend on what the group thinks we should do. We should resist politicians and other people who want us to click together and identify on the basis of certain superficial, meaningless characteristics. We should go back inside and discover our common humanity. Last, bit of begging off I'm going to do. I don't want to leave the impression that I feel that traditional people are somehow dumb or backward. And if I have implied that by promoting the literate lifestyle, I've misspoken, because these are people who in many cases I'm envious of. I think we all are. They live such a simple life. They have togetherness. They are not racked by questions about how they fit into it all. They have a lot of the qualities of children, and I think we would all like to be children again. And for many of us, that was the happiest time in our lives. But I want to say this: you can't. Once you're an adult, you can't go back. You're stuck with being an adult, even if, because of the complication of life, you're not quite as happy. You're not happy in the same way. You have different kinds of happiness, but the happiness is more complicated and more mottled. It's more, there's a certain degree of shadow in it, and there's always tomorrow to think about. It's not just, you can be so just blissfully, ecstatically happy as a kid, and you lose that. And you lose it for good when you become an adult. But you can't not be an adult. I would not want to start acting like a child, because I would have no respect for myself, and the people around me would be disgusted with me. So we are kind of, I think as literates, and it's important to realize this, we're stuck in responsibility. We're stuck trying to live life at this higher level. We may get tired. I'm sure we often do get tired of it. We want to throw down the burden. We want to be children again. We often physically go back to nature. We go camping or hiking or something, and that's a great outlet, a great relief. But eventually you have to come back and take the burden up again. I think that we rightfully respect and admire simple people living their simple lives, but our mission, because this is just where we are right now, is to cling to that deeper sense of inner purpose that we have and not give it up. That's the good fight. That's the one that we have to fight.